experience. Are we still being recorded?
Yes.
Okay, right. And that's why the Buddha started there. In fact, it's the most logical place to start a quest for understanding. And I think that in this sense, Buddhism is unique, because it seems to me that many other religions start with an idea that you try to have faith in, that you try to believe. Dukkha is not something you believe, it's a direct, real experience. Then we come to the second noble truth. What is the second noble truth? Second noble truth is the cause of suffering, the cause of dukkha. And according to the Buddha, it has two causes, ultimately, root causes. One is desire and craving. The other is ignorance and misunderstanding. So let's say craving and ignorance. So according to the Buddha, the more we want something, the more we cannot achieve it, the more we feel dukkha, frustration. Somebody who used to come to our center, I got to know him quite well. He became very, very interested in Buddhism, but he had a certain problem in his life, which he confessed to me. And this was that he was very self-conscious about being short. And he was noticeably short. And it caused him a great deal of, seemed to me, unnecessary unhappiness. He was very self-conscious of it. If he was in a crowd and somebody accidentally knocked him on the head, he would explode with anger. And nearly, he had good health, he was fairly good looking, he had a great job. He said everything about his life should have been okay, except that he was unable to accept that he was the way he was. And I think that things like this sort of are a microcosm of this idea that the more we want, the less fulfilled we are. So you can say that our wants are almost endless. Our ability to attain the things we want are not endless. But ultimately, craving also causes suffering in that, according to the Buddha, the energy or the force that brings us into a new life, that causes us to be reborn, is once again craving. Craving to live forever. Craving to avoid death. And in doing that, we actually, this craving compels us into a new birth when we die. And so even if we are happy and fulfilled, we will be reborn because we want to be reborn. We want to continue. And that's the very thing that brings us into a new life and the possibility of more dukkha. And the other thing is ignorance. The fact that we are, under normal circumstances, not able to understand this. We think that our dukkha will be eliminated if we get this, or if we go there, or if we marry this person, or if we divorce that person. We're constantly on the move, hoping that we will experience more happiness and less frustration and wanting. And this seems to be an endless process. And in the fact that this brings us to a new birth really does make it literally an endless process. So that's the second noble truth. The cause of dukkha is ignorance and craving and ignorance. The third noble truth is that it is possible to free ourselves from this cycle. In other words, there is a problem, but there is also a solution. And the solution is to attain a state that the Buddha called, well, he gave many terms for it, but the most well-known term is nibbana, or in Sanskrit, nirvana. Now, some people think that I've watched some YouTubes about Buddhism, and several of them describe nirvana as the Buddhist heaven. Or I've heard nirvana described as annihilation, that when we die, we cease to exist. So there seems to be a great deal of misunderstanding about this. What is nibbana or nirvana? Well, in order to understand it fully, we have to be well grounded in Buddhist philosophy, which we're not going to be able to do in this series of talks. So I'll just say this, that the Buddha emphasized very strongly that nirvana is not nothingness. In fact, on several occasions during his life, he was accused by others of teaching annihilation. And he very strongly objected to this. It said, I do not teach annihilation. The only annihilation I teach is the annihilation of greed, hatred, and delusion. The annihilation of negative mental states that cause us all sorts of difficulties in our life. So then people say, well, is it eternal? Do we go to nirvana? Is it some sort of subtle state? Well, once again, the Buddha he didn't answer that question the way we would expect to. Do I exist in nirvana? Well, then we would have to answer the question, what do we mean by to exist? Do I exist? Well, yes, I think I do. No, that's not, sorry. It's not that I think I do. I know I do. I mean, you can see me. I exist just as you do. So what does my existence mean? Well, it means that I have a body. I take up space. It means I have an orientation in space. It means that I have experiences. I can remember my past. I can experience my present. I can imagine, sometimes quite realistically, my future. So all of I eat. Under some circumstances, a human being's existence involves their ability to reproduce, to feel, to think, to imagine, all of that. So does that exist in nirvana? No, it doesn't. So when we say you don't exist in nirvana, that doesn't mean that you are not, or there is nothing there. I think the most famous thing that the Buddha said about this was his very famous statement in the Udana, where he says, and I will read it, there is an unborn, an unbecome, an unmade, an uncompounded. If there was not this unborn, unbecome, unmade, uncompounded, there would be no escape from the born, the become, the made, the compounded. But as there is an unborn, an unbecome, an unmade, an uncompounded, there is an escape from the born, the become, the made, the compounded. So here he's saying is the ordinary conditioned state, that is the state we're in now, involves being born, coming into being, then becoming, that is existing through time, and then made or created, put together, and then compounded, that is made up of parts. There is such a state. And then he tells us at the same time, there is a state that is not born. It is not become. It is not made. It is not compounded. And beyond that, he really doesn't say very much, but clearly he had experienced that state himself. And he believed that by understanding dukkha and the cause of dukkha, it would be possible to overcome craving and ignorance and abide in that state. And the fourth noble truth is how to overcome dukkha. So once again, we have dukkha, the cause of dukkha, the possibility of overcoming or transcending dukkha, and how to do that. So many people think that the Buddha copied this idea or these ideas, these related ideas, from the medical theories of the time, ancient Indian medical concepts. So you go to a doctor because you're sick. The doctor then examines you and he tells you what caused your sickness. And then he said, but don't worry about it. We do have a treatment or a medicine for that sickness. And this is how you should take it. Take 3 tablets once a day or whatever. Now, this is very widely believed that the Buddha did copy this idea from ancient Ayurveda. Unfortunately, in the ancient Ayurvedic texts, some of which date from shortly after the Buddha, we'd get nothing like this system. So he probably didn't. Nonetheless, it is very well thought out, it's very precise, and it makes its points very clear. Okay? There is a problem. This problem is individual, within ourselves. We have a problem with those around us. And the places where we live sometimes have problems with other places. For example, in the world right now, there are at least 4 or 5 major conflicts going on between different countries. States have conflicts with each other. Groups have conflicts with each other. Individuals have conflicts with other individuals. And sometimes we're in conflict with ourselves. We feel guilty or inadequate or whatever it happens to be. So these are the 4 noble truths. So you might say that the first 2 or the first 3 of the 4 noble truths are how Buddhism sees the world in which we live, and the problems we face. And the 4th noble truth is what we do about it, how we resolve these conflicts and problems within ourselves, between others, ourselves and others, and so on. So you might say that the 4th noble truth is by far the most important one. Let's have a look at it briefly. It's called, the 4th noble truth is called the Buddha's Noble Eightfold Path. It consists of 8 steps. You might call them 8 steps of training. What are these? Well, the first one is Samma Ditti, right understanding. The second one is Samma Sankappa, right thought or right intention. The next one is Samma Vacha, right speech. The next one is Samma Kammanta, right action. The next one is Samma Ajiva, right livelihood. The next one is Samma Vayama, right effort. The next one is Samma Sati, right mindfulness. And the final one is Samma Samadhi, right understanding. Now, In my book, all about Buddhism, I have some comments about this word samma, samaditi, samma sankappa, samavacha, and so on. And in the book, I render that Pali word as perfect. And it seems to have done just confuse people, because almost everybody else uses the word right. So I just want to make a comment about this. The Pali word samma, or its Sanskrit equivalent, samyak, is actually related to some words in European languages, English, for example. So when world leaders meet because of some international problem, agreement, this is called a summit, meaning a coming together of the top guys, of the top people. A mountain climber endeavors to reach the summit of the mountain. In our year, the summer is the high point. In Western philosophy, in Latin, the ultimate goal is the summum bonum, the ultimate goal, or the top goal. And so in English alone, as in Pali, Samma doesn't really mean right. The problem with the word right is, as soon as we hear the word right, we think of either left or wrong. And as we'll see a little bit later, the steps on the Noble Eightfold Path aren't really right, because that would mean that other ways are wrong. So I think that the best term is perfect, in the sense of complete or whole. And I really do think that this is not a minor thing. I think it's an important thing. You see, we live in a world where there are many different religions, and most of them say, well, we're right and all the others are wrong. Buddhism doesn't actually say that. If we keep in mind the idea of Samma, it's the Buddhist path is whole, complete. The other paths are not bad, they're not wrong. It's just that they're not complete. So they have their good sides. They have their important truths. They teach, many of them teach noble values. So to reject them would be a mistake. What they need is simply more understanding to complete that path. So certainly the Noble Eightfold Path is the best path, but that doesn't mean that the others are wrong. So a translation of Samma as complete or whole or integral, I think is actually important. However, almost everywhere, this is Samma is always translated as right, so we'll stick with that. Okay. So these are the steps: right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Now, in the coming talks, we're going to talk about each of those steps, but I won't go into that now. We'll just talk more about these steps. Now, traditionally, the Noble Eightfold Path is divided as Sila, Samadhi, and Panya. Ethics, morality, meditation, and understanding. In fact, the Buddha makes that division himself. I find it more interesting to divide it like this, as intellectual training, ethical training, and psychological training. So intellectual training would be the first step, right understanding. Ethical training would be the next four, right speech, right action, right livelihood. Sorry, the next three. They would be the next four, yes. Right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood. That would be the ethical component. And the last three would be psychological, energy, determination, making an effort, developing mindfulness, and developing samadhi. So I think it can be useful just to use a different division, subdivision. It's just a thing that I find useful. Maybe you will too. Also, I think it's important to point out that this path has got certain quite unique characteristics. So the Noble Eightfold Path is complete. It has everything you'd need. So, for example, one of the steps on the Noble Eightfold Path is right livelihood. I don't know of any other spiritual path where the work you do is taken into account, but the Buddha did take it into account. Probably because he realized most people, certainly today, a good percentage of their time will be working. No work, no eat. And the type of work we do could have a profound impact upon our lives, positive or negative, or both. So it's very interesting, and it says something about the comprehensiveness of the Noble Eightfold Path, that it would include something like this. And then even if you take the second noble truth, right thought, how you think about things. So normally our thinking is seen as a private thing. I may very well give the impression that I like you, but actually I think something really quite different. So we wouldn't usually include that in ethics. As long as you didn't do anything nasty to me, your thoughts, your private thoughts are your business. They would only be considered to have an ethical component if you then acted on your thoughts. But you look at your own thoughts. We think all sorts of things, but never act upon them because perhaps it's not appropriate. And yet the Buddha thought, his idea was that thinking can be very, very powerful. It can motivate us. It can affect us, even if we don't act upon them. So he took that into account. And if you look at the last two steps on the Noble Eightfold Path, which together constitute what we would call meditation. And once again, it's all very well to say, love your enemies, but how? Sometimes they can be very, very trying. So the Buddha taught us really quite a comprehensive and effective series of, if you like, mental exercises to train our minds so that we can actually bring about transformations in our thought patterns, our emotions, etc. So in that sense, it's a very comprehensive path. I think another characteristic of the Noble Eightfold Path is that it is always valid. It hasn't gone out of date. In fact, the Buddha called his Dhamma, meaning the Noble Eightfold Path, akaliko, timeless. So once again, when we look at some of the spiritual paths around, sometimes some of their ideas have dated or are no longer accepted. Science has made them no longer believable. And so they're quietly put aside and the more relevant doctrines are explained. It seems to me that you don't have to do that with Buddhism, or at least with the Noble Eightfold Path. Now, there are certainly some ideas in Buddhism that do not correspond to normal modern understanding. That is certainly the case. I can think of quite a few. But they're not the essentials. So we were talking about the nature of the universe. Buddha's understanding, or at least what he taught about the nature of the universe. Now, some of those ideas directly contradicted by modern science, but that doesn't matter because that's not essential. In the case of the Noble Eightfold Path, it seems to me that even in 500 years from now, these ideas, these concepts, these training programs would still be valid. And one of the reasons they would be valid is because probably in 500 years from now, human beings would still have the same or very similar problems. Another thing about the Noble Eightfold Path that I think is important, and it is one that is summed up by an alternative name that the Buddha gave to the Noble Eightfold Path. He called it the Majjhima Patipada, the middle way. That is, by that he meant the middle way between extreme asceticism on one hand and sensual self-indulgence on the other. But I think if you actually read what the Buddha said, you find that many things that he said were a middle way between lots of extremes. Close-mindedness on the one hand and non-discrimination on the other. There's a tendency in some quarters of the world nowadays to all religions are the same, all points of view are valid. The Buddha wouldn't agree with that. On the other hand, I think whatever accusations you can say about Buddhism, narrow-mindedness and bigotry is not one of them. For the most part, Buddhism has always been a fairly tolerant faith. So a middle path between closed-mindedness, bigotry, and non-discrimination, all truths are the same. I think it is a middle way between blind faith and skepticism. We see this where the Buddha actually encouraged his disciples to examine him over a period of time, to observe him in different situations to see how he behaved, to see whether what he claimed about himself was actually true. He actually invited his disciples to do that. There is actually a very interesting incident in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta where Sariputta says to the Buddha, I think you're the greatest teacher who has ever lived, who is alive now, or who will live and teach in the future. Most teachers would like to hear their students say something like that. And the Buddha's reaction to this is very interesting. He said to Sariputta, "Oh, your words are very bold indeed. Your claim is very bold indeed. It's a real sihanada, a real lion's roar. And do you know all of the great teachers of the past?" Sariputta said, "No." "Do you know all the great teachers today?" "I haven't met them all." "Do you know all the great teachers who may come in the future?" He said, "No." I think this is very, very interesting. He didn't want people just to believe because of who he was or what he claimed about himself. He wanted people to think. And that's a very good example. He gently pointed out to his disciple, it was a wonderful thing to say. I'm really glad you appreciate me, but don't overdo it. So there, between blind faith, the middle way between blind faith and skepticism. And then there would be another one, say, between trying too hard, overdoing it on the one hand, or just taking it easy on the other. I think this is important because we live in a culture nowadays where we want to get everything quickly. We've got institutions called fast food outlets. Why do you have to get your food so fast? What's the hurry? The whole idea of supermarkets was so you can get in, get it, and get out quick. And what do we do with all that time we save? So in today's world, particularly in modern consumer societies, there is this emphasis upon that it's not much good unless you can get it now. Nowadays I used to buy books from bookshops. Now I get them sometimes on Amazon. And it just astonishes me how quickly you order a book and you can get it in 3 or 4 days. I mean, it's great. I wouldn't mind waiting a month, but it's certainly nice to get it quick. Now, as far as the Noble Eightfold Path is concerned, this may create some problems for us, in that we think by walking this path, particularly in meditation, that if the results don't come, if we don't see results within a short period of time, we think it doesn't work, or it won't work. Now, the reality is that, well, I mean, I've known people who've done 3 or 4 meditation retreats, and they say after that, I couldn't really see much. I got some insights, but I can't really see much change in my mind. And I always say to them, oh, goodness, it took the Buddha 6 years, might take you that long. But the nature of us, as we've been conditioned by our consumer society, is that we want things to happen quickly. We want the results to come soon, and we lose interest if it doesn't happen. And that would be a big mistake. The reality is spiritual evolution and growth does take time. It may take a long time, according to the individual, how much energy and determination they put into it. So, on the other hand, it's not an endless project. So I think this is another important aspect of the Buddha's Noble Eightfold Path. It's a middle way between not just the extreme of severe asceticism and sensual overindulgence, but I would say between all or many extremes. So that is the Four Noble Truths. I'll just reiterate the main points. Dukkha, which has a wide variety of meanings, basically suffering, inadequacy, incompleteness, stress. The cause of suffering, ignorance and craving. The third noble truth, the possibility of transcending this state. And the fourth noble truth, how to transcend that state by walking the Noble Eightfold Path. And the culmination of that path in this life, or maybe the next life, or perhaps some other lives further down the road, will be what the Buddha called akupa ceta vimukti, utter freedom of mind. And that is the aim, that is the goal, that is the culmination. Okay, that's all I have to say for this afternoon. If there's anything anybody would like to, any questions anybody would like to ask, I'd be very happy to try to answer them.
The very first question is, knowing that this world is filled with suffering, why would anyone want to be reborn and come back? Kindly comment.
Well, the reality is that we do. It's extraordinary, and not only human beings, animals too. When their life is endangered, they will do just about anything to avoid dying. So we seem to be built like that. But there may be somebody like the questioner may have got to the stage where they don't want to be reborn. Okay, so I suppose that would be the situation that somebody would turn to the Dhamma if they got to that stage. Whereas, once again, in most religions, the whole purpose of the religion is so that you can live forever. It's some sort of heaven realm. Whereas Buddhism says that to live in the sense of conditioned existence is a problem to be solved. So if somebody gets to the stage where they accept the basic principles of Buddhism, then probably they would embark upon a path that would hopefully end where they opt out, as it were, and they attain Nibbana or Nirvana. Anything else?
Yes. The next question is, hi Bhante Dhammika, am I correct to say that we can presume the Buddha had experienced the state of unborn, unbecome, unmade, and uncompounded for himself to say that there are such states, and therefore that is what one will experience when one attains Nibbana?
So the question is, had the Buddha attained the unborn, unmade, etc.? Well,
yes.
Very clearly, he had. He had a direct personal experience of that. And I think it's important to point out that there are two levels of nirvana. So you could say nirvana in this life, the problem has been solved, but you still have a body, so you can still suffer physical pain and hunger, etc. But then when your body falls away, when you finally die, then you are not reborn, then you attain full nirvana, you might call it. So that's traditionally how they divide it. So the Buddha attained nibbana under the Bodhi tree, and he attained final nirvana when he passed away. So yes, you're right.
Okay. Thank you, Bhante. Third question. Is the continuous desire to learn the Dhamma considered as dukkha?
Is considered
Dukkha.
Well, I certainly know some people who it does become a problem for them. So I think really what you're saying is there such thing as good desires? Okay. So when people hear the second noble truth, they say, how can you possibly desire to attain a state of non-desiring? So is it, how can you ever get out of this cycle if you want to attain nirvana? Isn't that a form of wanting? Yeah, of course it is. Huh? But there's wanting and wanting, there's craving and craving. So there are, I mean, ordinary people leading their ordinary life do have ambitions, wants, and desires. And some of them are very good, they are noble. So, what I always say to people who ask something like that is, how about come to terms with your negative desires first, and then we'll talk about those other ones later.
Right. Bhante, what about the term chanda? I mean, is chanda not supposed to reflect something that is a wholesome desire or aspiration?
Chanda is a nice word. It's one of my favorite Pali words. It literally means something like grabbing something.
Wholesome way, right?
Well, it depends on what you're grabbing at.
Like the Dhamma, for example, this desire.
Yeah, well, I'm not so sure that people sort of grab at the Dhamma, but actually, sometimes the Buddha uses the word karma. Karma almost always means sensual desire, but sometimes there is actually several places where he talks about karma Dhamma, a desire for the Dhamma. So he certainly doesn't mean it in the sense of, say, sexual desire or desire to have power over others. He doesn't mean it in that sense, but he clearly uses that quite strong term. Karma is another one, which means, once again, to love yourself, self-love. Now, like I said, normally the word karma means sensual desire, but clearly the Buddha doesn't mean it in this sense. Anyway, my point is that, yeah, there are wholesome and constructive desires that lead to understanding, and eventually the slow cooling down of all desires, but that comes much later on the path.
Hi, Bhante Dhammika. I think what is also unique about the Buddha's teachings is the notion of the 5 grasping aggregates, which is certainly not something that other religions even have elements of. I wonder how the Buddha was able to see and identify these. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think this comes to, yes, I agree with you. I think this comes down to the first step on the Noble Eightfold Path, right understanding. So in the process of his spiritual quest, perhaps it was something that he'd done in his past life or previous lives, he was aiming in the right direction. So he put his finger on the problem, which was dukkha. Now, he wouldn't have been the first person to do that. But if you look at many religions and philosophies, they are aware of that problem too. But then they will do something, they will say, well, it's all due to devils, evil forces. Or if only we pray to this deity or that deity, then we'll be able to solve our problems. Or whatever, we elect another political party, a particular political party, and they'll solve the problems. And or they retreat into hope. If only we could love each other. Yeah, but the reality is we can't. So I think what happened was early on in the Buddha's quest, he had what he later called sammaditthi, a right understanding. And he started looking at immediate realities rather than dreams and ideas and theories and etc. And so he turned his attention to himself, and he analyzed the human individual into 5 parts, the aggregates. He then understood this process of clinging and craving, and he worked it out for himself. He had these profound insights. I think his 4 or 5 years of very rigorous mental training allowed him to clarify his mind to the degree that he had this, we use the word insight. He saw in. He had, what's the Pali word? I can't remember the Pali word now, but a deep looking in, and that's how he worked it out. And I certainly would agree with the person who asked that question. It's quite a unique idea.
Yep.
It seems to me that most religions are looking outside the individual. The Dhamma is turning this around and looking inside.
Yep.
And it's a very precise analysis. It doesn't seem to be based on wild theories. Yes, there is a body. Yes, I have feelings, and so on and so on. So yeah, that's how he did it, I think.
Right. Personal experience.
Mm.
Right. Next question. In a fast-paced society, there is now a higher rate of suicide when someone is overwhelmed with worldly problems. How would you advise someone in that situation that it is still worthwhile to continue living?
Yeah, well, as it so happens, as a monk, I have had people sometimes, 3 occasions I can remember quite vividly, of people ringing me up, telling me that they wanted to commit suicide. And in one of those cases, the person actually was saying to me, he was ringing me to say goodbye because he'd already decided to do it. So my feeling is that people generally don't consider suicide because life in general is so awful, but rather they have a very specific crisis in their life. So it's not one thing, it's one it's not a general feeling that life is not worthwhile, or they have that idea because of one particular crisis or event in their life. So I think, firstly, if somebody tells you that they're seriously considering suicide, I think it's very important to take it seriously and get them to talk to you and listen. And don't try to talk them out of it. First of all, just let them talk. And the approach that I have taken is I've said to people, think of the loved ones you've left behind. So you may have solved your problem, but you will have created terrible problems for your loved ones because they will never forgive themselves for not noticing that this was happening. They'll blame themselves. So you're out of it, but you've created really some dreadful problems for those you know. And the second thing is, even though things clearly are very dark and serious in that, there was a time when you didn't have this problem, and so it's actually possible that there will be a time when you don't have it. So if you can hang on, or what have you, it's possible that the situation will change. So that's what I would say to somebody. there's always the possibility of change and transformation if you're alive. If you're dead, that of course is no longer possible. And according to the Buddha, that particular problem wouldn't follow you, but you'll certainly be reborn with, I mean, if you commit suicide, it's almost as negative as killing somebody else. So you will carry that into your next life. And so from a Buddhist perspective, you won't really have solved the problem. You'll have just put it on hold until you start growing up in your next life. So I'd always encourage people to seek help if you've got to that stage. And if you know people who have said that sometimes they've thought of doing that, or they're thinking of doing that, do counsel them, not by constantly trying to convince them not to do it, but letting them talk, letting them say what they feel the problem is, and listening sympathetically and carefully to them.
Thank you, Bhante. Next question. Venerable Bhante, why did Sariputta make the bold proclamation that Buddha is the best teacher ever? Isn't that bold statement true, seeing that the Buddha is a Sammasambuddha? Sorry, actually there are two questions here. Okay, so first question is, why did Sariputta make the bold proclamation in the first place?
Out of regard for his teacher. Makes sense.
Right.
So the Buddha wasn't scolding him for honoring him and articulating his great regard and respect for the Buddha. He wasn't doing that. It's just what he said. Okay. He said, of all those in the past, well, what about past Buddhas? Did you know them? What about possible future Buddhas? Did you know them? So it was just an exaggerated statement of faith, regard, and respect. But what was going on in the exact motives, I don't know, because I can't ask Sariputta.
Right. And the second question, isn't that bold statement true, though, seeing that the Buddha is a Sammasambuddha?
Well, that's possible too. But once again, like I said, that the Buddha wasn't shooting him down for that. He was shooting him down because clearly he didn't know. So he was bringing him down to earth in a gentle way, but I think it was very good. Right. Next question.
Bhante, a question for you from me then.
Right.
You know, in your book, you had actually said
which book are we talking about?
All About Buddhism.
Oh, right.
Okay. Where it is actually in the paragraph talking about the middle path, the middle way, and you were talking about extremism. And this line about extremism saying that it is characterized by the belief that only one way is right. So I'm just thinking as Buddhists, because we believe in the Noble Eightfold Path, would we in some way be labeled an extremist for believing in that one path being the right path to help us attain liberation?
Well, although I think religious extremism and religious bigotry is not characteristic of Buddhism and never has been.
Yeah.
I think the institutions of Buddhism have had their problems. Definitely not perfect, but intolerance and bigotry I don't think has been very characteristic of Buddhism. However, I can think of two religious Buddhist organizations that I think would qualify to be extremist. One from Japan another one, well, we won't talk about it, but I do think so. So, yes, I think that is possible, but I don't think that that's characteristic of Buddhism. And it
Okay.
seems to me that through history, for the most part, not always, but for the most part, Buddhism has not been, and most Buddhists are not extremists in that sense, in the sense we're talking about. Like I said, I think they've got some. In fact, one of the problems Buddhists might have is that they don't have strong enough commitment to their practice.
At one point.
Yeah, that might be one of the problems they have. Many of them, anyway.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Looks like there's one more question. Oh, no, two.
Two more.
Okay.
Okay. So I'll read out the first of the last two. As there is the existence of Nibbana, is there an existence of the opposite? If it does, what would that be? Hell?
No, no. And like we said, the problem with using the term existence, Nibbana doesn't exist. It doesn't non-exist either. How about we put that question aside for later on when we get to know the fundamentals of Buddhism much better than we do now, and then we can go into actually the nature of Nibbana.
All right. So we'll park that and we'll revisit that question, brother.
Yeah.
The final question is,
Yeah, we make this the last one now.
yeah, the last one. Is it true that the chance of being reborn as a human is like a turtle swimming in an open ocean, and when it surfaces his head out of water, he hits a buoy in the middle? Yes.
Right. Okay.
Right.
So that's a good question. Yeah. Okay. So in one place, the Buddha said being reborn as a human being is a rare opportunity. It's a rare privilege. And that it would be as unlikely as this. That is, if there was a yoke, let's say a life buoy, floating in the ocean, and once in 100 years, a turtle were to come to the surface and put his head through the ring of the life buoy, that would be pretty, and the chances of that happening would be very, very remote. And the Buddha said, and being reborn as a human being is just as remote. Wow, that's a bit of a problem. Okay, so this is what I think, that at the time the Buddha said that may have been the case. I mean, 2,500 years ago, it was a pretty rough and ready world. Okay. So many of the concepts and ideas that have evolved, partly due to the teachings of Buddhism, but not only Buddhism, Christianity and Confucianism. So many of those ideas were not around at that time. Life was very hard. It was, you had cattle raiding and vicious tribal wars and this sort of thing. Now, the world's a pretty rough place even now, but we have widespread ethical values in most cultures and civilizations. So I think that what the Buddha said at that time was valid for that time, but things have changed since then. Humanity has evolved. Very few people, for example, really not that long ago, in many cultures, slavery was considered just an ordinary institution. Very few people would agree with that now. We've changed, we've evolved, we've got better. Our ethical values and principles have evolved a great deal. So I would say that would not be necessarily the case now.